Uh, Continuing on from criticising the theory of production, classical theory of production, the previous lecture, let's now look at consumption. And this is another classic instance of a theory which is neat, plausible, and wrong, but so seductive that its adherents believe it describes reality, which it simply can't. So the basic idea is, and this is why it sounds so plausible, we're assumed to maximise our utility. And if everybody does that, why did the chicken cross the road? To maximise its utility. That's an explanation for every answer, every question. But the basic idea is here, the way it's done in pure and mathematically logical. You have a consumer facing a budget constraint. And the budget constraint is a straight line linking the amount of a particular good that it could purchase, the consumer could purchase if they owes all their income with that good, to another one, which they could also choosing a point where they'd spend all their income with that good. So this is the classic position which is given to a first-year student. This is out of Nordhaus and Samuelson once more. So you have a straight line linking m units of spending on food, which is 4 units of food, whatever that turns out to be, and 6 units of clothing. And both those amounts completely exhaust the consumer's budget, and then there's a question of what point along that straight line will maximise their utility. So the idea is to give utilities using what's called an indifference map. And for those who haven't come across this concept before, lucky you, you can imagine the maps you see on a weather map on TV, linking points of equal pressure. So the idea is there's a range of different places where the pressure is the same in a weather system, and this is the same sort of idea, saying there's a range of different combinations of goods that will give the consumer the same utility. Well, that's an abstract measure of satisfaction. So here's the utility curve, again from Mankiw and Nordhaus, and those are the points, all those points A, B, C, and D give the same utility to this consumer, so the consumer is therefore indifferent between whether receiving A or B or C or D. Then you combine the two, you put the budget line and the indifference curves on the same diagram, and you find the point on the highest indifference curve. It's like the highest pressure in a weather map, and that's the point that maximises the consumer's utility given their budget and given their tastes. Now, that is, to work out the demand curve from that, what is next done is to vary the price of food while keeping the price of clothing and the income of the consumer constant. And if that's the case, the point N on this diagram doesn't move. And that's essential to the forthcoming critique of how the theory is worked out. So here's 2 price levels, one that enables you to buy 2 units of food. So M dashed means a higher price for food than M does. But the idea is you vary that price, you find the consumer will buy B units or B double dashed units at this particular price ratio, B units at this one, and you can drag out a line showing the effect of the changing the price on the amount the consumer will pay to buy food, and that combination is what's maximising utility, given the combination of their budget and an unchanging price for clothing and a changing price for food. Now, this was critiqued by some people saying, well, you can't actually see this indifference curve. It's unknowable. How can we use an unknowable concept like indifference as an essential part of a theory? And he said, well, true, but actually we can work backwards. We can see what they do and then derive their indifference curves from their actual behaviour. So the idea was you offer consumers a range of different shopping trolleys that contain different combinations of goods. So you have three shopping trolleys facing this particular consumer. And you have a range of axioms that are supposed to describe rational behaviour by this consumer. And the first one, and actually the weakest, strongest in terms of its impact, weakest in terms of its realism, is a rational consumer can decide which shopping trolley she prefers. Is it the red, the blue or the green? Now, transitivity then comes in and that says, well, if you prefer the red to the green and the green to the blue, then you must prefer the red to the blue. So, combinations that a choice of A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then A is greater than C. Non-satiation and this is an assumption which is so typically mainstream economics, more is preferred to less. So if you prefer trolley R and I add one more item to it, then you definitely prefer the modified R to the original R. And then convexity, and this is slightly complicated to think about, but a linear combination of two trolleys is preferred to either of the trolleys themselves. And that's because you have given the shape of your utility combination. If you have 2 points that you are indifferent to, and you can do a straight line combination of the 2, then that straight line will be above the utility given by the 2 points, and therefore you must prefer a combination above that line. Now, I've never had a chance to catch up with the academic who did this, German academic, surname of Sippel, and my expectation is he wanted to show to his students that this theory is real. You know, it might sound abstract and unrealistic. Well, let's do it. Let's do an experiment. So what he did was initially, I think, with just 12 students, and that to me is the size of a tutorial class. He decided to test these preferences in a very carefully designed experiment. Then he repeated it with 30 students, so he had 40 in total. And here's the spoiler alert, completely trashed the theory. But the idea was to give students a well-worked out test that doesn't suffer from all the other problems that can apply when you try to assess a theory about behaviour like this by using statistics, by looking at choice over time, when obviously over time your taste can change and so on. So this was an experiment all done in one place with one set of one period of time, and after the students have made their choices, then they had actually consumed the goods that they did with this game. So the goods that were being offered to the students were video clips. You know, watch 30 to 60 minutes of a video clip, play a computer game for much the same length of time, read a magazine, drink some Coke, orange juice, coffee, candy, pretzels and peanuts. And you were given a range of different combinations that you would apply of each of these. And Sippel actually said that students, when they were given the relative prices, the budget constraint they faced, and these various goods, they would then choose the combination that they thought they most would enjoy given that combination. And they then, I think they were given about 10 different combinations each time, and then they did about 10 tests. And the students even expressed their preferences between the ones they chose in each of the experiments because they got a randomly chosen one of those was the one that they got. So they were seriously working out what they liked, seriously calculating what would be supposedly maximising the utility. Well, when the experiment was done, Sippel found, and I quote, a considerable number of violations of the axioms of revealed preference, contradicting the idea that consumers are maximising utility subject to a budget constraint. And he then said we should be much more circumspect about treating this as the theory of the actual behaviour of people. And given that, we should be less imperialist in our ambitions about explaining behaviour using non-market behaviour using economic principles. So something went wrong about this basic idea of explaining people's tastes using a combination of a budget line and indifference curves. And the basic problem was too many shopping trolleys, what's called the curse of dimensionality. So if you're given, let's say there were just 10 discrete choices that you were given. You can choose 0 units or 1 or 2 or 3 out to 9 units of each good. And there are 8 goods in the experiment that Sippel did, remember. So if there's just one commodity, then you can have 10 shopping trolleys, one with nothing in it, and the other with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And of course, you're going to choose the one with 9. Now, when there's 2 commodities, then you're going to have 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, etc., etc. There'll be 100 different shopping trolleys. That's getting to be a fairly challenging combination. 3 is 1,000. 8, which is the experiment, is 100 million shopping trolleys. Now, how are you going to make your mind up when you've got 100 million different choices? Okay? It becomes simply analytically and computationally overwhelming. And the result is people use a whole range of heuristics. We buy the same thing we bought last time round. We satisfy, so we don't try to maximize, we get what is necessary. We categorize, we buy things we must have. You must buy both food and drink. You can spend less on clothing, etc., etc. So the whole idea that you can work out a complete vision of what you like is impossible because of the curse of dimensionality. And I'm just using a toy example there. If you imagine going inside a standard supermarket, and even if you said like there's 100 different types of products inside that supermarket, and you wanted to make a choice about whether you do or do not buy one element of each, you've got 2 to 100 different choices to make. That's an overwhelming number. So consequently, we can't go in and do the computational work that is necessary for this to actually work as a description of actual behaviour. And if you try to impose this model on people's actual shopping behaviour, you will find their shopping behaviour violates this model. And as I said, if we had, I mentioned just 2 choices of a 10 to the 20, you get an idea of how ridiculous it is to imagine you can have a complete set of your preferences. So what we've got, what looks like a persuasive model, is a toy model. It works on a sheet of paper with two goods drawn on it. It doesn't work when you get out into the real world. So we can just throw this thing away. It is a useless way of trying to visualise how people behave. So again, just to show that once more, that's the way it's described in the textbook. Now in the real world, you have, as I said, this is just showing Sippel's experiment. If there were 10 choices, then there are 10 axes, each with 10 entries on it, and the number of combinations is 8 to the 10. It is just simply impossible to work out what you like out of that and obey what is called the axioms of revealed preference, because that requires a level of computational capacity that we simply don't have. So consumers don't utility maximise, they satisfy us in their shopping behaviour. But that's just looking at the individual level, so it doesn't describe individual behaviour. But even if it did, could it then describe market behaviour? And here's one of the classic own goals in economics, what's known as the Sonnenschein-Mantel-Debreu problem, conditions, or theorem. Now, if you read the textbooks, of course, you'll learn all about this. Not. You get something like this from Samuelson and Nordhaus. The market demand curve is found by adding together the quantities demanded by all individuals at each price. So you have a consumer Smith, consumer Brown, combine the two together, and there's your market demand curve. And does the market demand curve obey the law of downward sloping demand? It certainly does, says Samuelson and Nordhaus. Well, that's the greatest load of, well, it's up there in terms of bullshit statements by mainstream economists, because when you look at what's actually required to make this become the result, it's simply absurd. So how do you derive individual demand curves? Again, I kept emphasising that when you do that, you show a range of different prices with a fixed price for the commodity, the other commodity, and a fixed income. Now that's fine, having as a fixed point when you're considering an isolated individual. But this is looking at food versus clothing, and of course, most people are not food producers. But when you look at the entire economy, then the entire, because to derive a market demand curve, you have to be considering all the potential shoppers in that economy, and that will include people who produce food. So when you look at a person in isolation, it's fair enough to say that changing the price of food doesn't affect their income, and therefore the fixed point that we're showing up the top there, which depends upon both the price of clothing, which is not being varied, and their income, which is not being varied, that point being a fixed point is okay. But if you're going to derive a market demand curve, then you have to include everybody in the economy, including those who make their income from food. Now, if you change the price of food, you're going to change the income of food producers. And then it starts to get extremely tricky, because that affects the income of food producers directly. It affects the price of income of other people indirectly. And that point N, the so-called fixed point, will move. And this is an essential part of economic theory again. They tell you that prices determine incomes. So therefore, when you change relative prices, you're going to change the distribution of income. And therefore that point, which was fixed in the case of an isolated individual, when you try to add up everybody's demand in the marketplace, that curve is now a moving point. Goes all over the place. Now, under what conditions can you take account of that and say, okay, we're going to allow changing prices to change income? So when we change the position from M dash to M, we know we're going to be changing income as well. So the point N has also to move. Under what conditions can you allow that to happen and still derive a downward sloping market demand curve? Well, this is hilarious because Samuelson actually set up these conditions correctly back in 1956. He said, allocating the same totals differently among people must generally change the resulting equilibrium price ratio. The only exception is where tastes are identical, not only for all men, but also for all men, whether they are rich or poor. Now, if that doesn't strike you as absurd, there's something wrong with your reasoning capacities. The only way they could ensure that you got a downward sloping market demand curve, where the market demand curve is supposed to reflect differences in tastes, are where all tastes are the same, and where those tastes are same between people, so we all have the same preferences, but also we have exactly the same preferences as we get richer or poorer. That is a proof by contradiction that you cannot derive a downward sloping market demand curve from a theory of individual utility maximising behaviour. So your tastes, for this to work, your tastes have to be the same as everybody else's tastes, and your taste must not change as your income level rises. So if you consume, say, 7 pizzas and 1 toilet roll, when you earn $100 a week, you've got to consume 700 pizzas and 100 toilet rolls when you earn $10,000 a week. There's a slight complication there in terms of marginals and the point of intersection of what's called an Engels curve with the horizontal axis, but generally speaking, that's correct caricature of what's being assumed by neoclassicals to derive a downward sloping market demand curve from summing up the demand curves of individuals. Now, you'd think this is obviously crazy. The reaction of economists to this should have been, oh dear, we can't derive a downward sloping market demand curve from our theory. So either the market demand curve is all over the place or there's something wrong in our theory. Now the point that's wrong, and I'll emphasise this straight away, is that the theory of individual behaviour leaves out the distribution of income. Whole idea of drawing my utility maximising behaviour and Rupert Murdoch's utility maximising behaviour, we're leaving out of the question the distribution of income between myself and Rupert Murdoch. If we include the distribution of income, then the reason why the demand curves slope downwards, inverted commas, in the real world is because things get more expensive, poor people can't afford to buy them. That's about as deep as they have to get. But rather than saying, well, we've got to either bring the distribution of income into our theory of individual behaviour, and that takes us back to the classical school, which did categorise people as workers, capitalists, landlords, etc., and therefore categorise people by their income level and their source of income. And therefore you had interpersonal comparisons as part of the way the classical school thought about individuals. Or you do what the neoclassicals did and they say, oh, this is reasonable. It's reasonable to assume tastes are identical. It's reasonable to assume that tastes will not change as people get wealthier. Now, this is from a person who beat Samuelson to the punch in working out this particular logical conundrum back in 1953. Now, have a look at how stupid this is. The necessary and sufficient condition quoted above is intuitively reasonable. It says, in effect, an extra unit of purchasing power should be spent in the same way, no matter to whom it is given. Now, that's blatantly nonsense. Absolutely blatantly nonsense. And the only reason that I can give any forgiveness to this stuff is that it's typical of what happens when somebody derives an answer that contradicts their preconceptions when they believe those preconceptions are rational. Max Planck spoke about this in terms of how physicists reacted to him proving that the only way to get around the blackbody radiation problem was to assume that energy came in discrete units he called quanta. He could never convince anybody apart from himself that made sense within his own circle of researchers. He had to wait for new students to come along who accepted it as a solution for the problem. So this happens with humanity all the time, but with most other disciplines, and I talk about this in a methodological lecture later on in this series, this only affects the old people in most sciences. The young people who are aware of whatever this problem is try to solve it themselves, and therefore you get scientific revolutions in genuine sciences as a result of this. But in economics you don't. Now here's Samuelson's. Remember, Samuelson was one who said, "It certainly does," talking about the market demand curve sloping downwards. He said, first of all, you aggregated from individual to family demand on the basis that since blood is thicker than water, the preferences of different members of a family are related by what we might call a social welfare function. So the family acts as if it was maximising its joint welfare function. So there are no unhappy families in America. That's really good to know. And then to aggregate from one family to another, and this is where you just go, what on earth are you smoking? The same argument will apply to all of society if optimal reallocations of income can be assumed to keep the ethical worth of each person's marginal dollar equal. In other words, for capitalism to function the way we think it does, there has to be a benevolent social dictator reallocating income before consumption occurs, and everybody's happy about the reallocation. This is American. Just crazy. Now, it's bad enough when, you know, this should have been leading him off to the, well, needs some therapy, obviously, if you believe something like this. But the textbooks then reproduce this nonsense. So I'll give Maskelyne one thing. At least Maskelyne talks about this particular issue. But how does he actually talk about it? Well, let us now hypothesize that there is a process, a benevolent central authority, perhaps. This is describing capitalism, kids. It's just ludicrous that this stuff gets published. It gets taken seriously. That for any set of prices P, an aggregate wealth function W redistributes wealth in order to maximise social welfare. These are the people talking about free market capitalism. But to justify their theory of it, they're willing to assume a benevolent central authority, which of course they do nothing to bring in to place. So we get the basic, raw and tooth and claw distribution of income being determined instead. But the crazy thing is, this is the nature of neoclassical theory. The rationalisations are simply nonsense. So what I've explained very quickly there is known as the Sonnenschein-Mantel-de Breuil theorem, and it's quite sophisticated mathematics to answer this problem. If you aggregate demand from individuals who each do have that downward sloping individual demand curve, so they behave rationally, as Sippel showed people don't in the beginning, but if you aggregate from those, the market demand that you get out of that can have any continuous real function shape at all. And that means that it's a curve, the demand curve you can derive from neoclassical theory. It's got nothing to do with reality. It's just saying, what can you derive from neoclassical theory? Is anything you can draw by running your finger along the page, going from left to right, never backtracking and never having crossing your own path. That line can be a demand curve. Now, of course, do you see demand curves like that in the textbook? Of course you don't. So the problem fundamentally is that neoclassical theory leaves out the distribution of income, whereas the classical school that preceded it included the distribution of income because it classified people into social groups. Now, if you change prices, you change the distribution of income. And when the distribution of income changes, then so will demand. And since the theory doesn't include that, it can't explain why demand will fall as price rises. So as well as using a supply curve that can't exist in the real world because marginal cost falls, they've got a theory of demand that can't exist even in their abstract world because their abstract world leaves out the distribution of income. So what looks like a neat, plausible theory is simply nonsense, and we should throw it out and start all over again on the foundations of the classical school and the physiocrats that preceded them, and I'll get into that in a subsequent lecture.